Welcome to the Regulation Podcast from the Institute of Regulation. My name is Martial Bou, Chair of the Institute and a regulator myself. On this month's podcast, we're talking about how to set up new regulators. Because despite ongoing talk of reducing regulatory burdens, etc., new regulators keep being established. There's the football regulator, for example, proposed by the UK's last Conservative government and now being set up by Labour. And a new Armed Forces Commissioner with legislation in Parliament now, and a new Audit, Reporting and Governance Authority proposed to replace the Financial Reporting Council, and so on. So I'm delighted to welcome two guests with over 20 years of collective experience setting up regulators from scratch. We've got Natalie Prosser, who's Chief Executive of the Office for Environmental Protection, a regulator created in 2021. Natalie's been CEO since the start. She's a solicitor by background, specialising in regulatory law, operations and governance, previously Director General Counsel at the Gambling Commission Directorate, the Qualifications Watchdog Ofqual, and the regulatory lead on the Independent Farm Inspection and Regulation Review. Goodness, that's a lot of experience. Welcome, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Marcel. I'm delighted to be here.
It's great to have you. And we also welcome Professor Sir Ian Kennedy, who, among many other senior roles and responsibilities, was the first chair of the Healthcare Commission, set up in 2003 to regulate healthcare and public health across England and Wales, whose functions were taken over by the Care Quality Commission when that was set up 6 years later. And then Ian set up another regulator, the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, IPSA, put in place in 2009 after the MP's expenses scandal. Ian was its chair from the beginning and for its first 7 years. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Martial.
So that's a massive amount of experience between you. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Before I ask how you set up your regulators, I want to ask why, first of all. Why was there a need for a regulator in these areas? And what was the problem that the regulator was an answer to? Ian, can I ask you first?
Yes, the Healthcare Commission was set up really because of concern about standards of care in the NHS. Interestingly, the obligation of the regulator was promote improvement, which is quite different from the normal view that regulators are there to push people about. So we might come back to that later. It was there to monitor standards and report on performance. As regards IPSA, as everyone knows, the system of expenses used by MPs had been abused to the extent that it had brought Parliament and MPs into disrepute. And so it was recognised that they needed a fresh start, and this time with an independent body.
That's. I'm sure everybody will remember those days. Headlines in the papers for many weeks. That was particularly a challenge for you, I'm sure. But both in respect of the Healthcare Commission and IPSA. Did you have any concerns about taking on these responsibilities from scratch?
Well, as regards the Healthcare Commission, it was an important task which was long overdue because there'd never been an overarching regulatory body, as it were, looking under the beds. And the problem that I confronted right at the outset was if there were to be standards, who's going to set them? The government or the regulator? The regulator would have to consult and so on and so forth. But if the government set the standards, there was a danger that the priorities would be political priorities rather than the priorities of those who looked after patients and patients themselves. So another qualm I had was it was only hospitals, not general practice, which seemed to me at the time quite crazy since so many more patients are seen by general practitioners. And a concern that all regulators have was funding. It was annual funding, and one soon became aware that funding could be used as a means of controlling you. If you didn't look into that, or you looked into that more closely, suddenly you'd find that your budget for the following year was somewhat affected. As regards the qualms I had as regards setting up IPSA, it was that you were sailing into a gale force wind. MPs and government privately thought the idea was entirely ghastly and would do their best to brief against you, even though publicly they had to say it was a jolly good idea, it was about time. So the qualm I had was that I had to confront the notion that I wouldn't be terribly popular and would see my name on the front page too many times.
Goodness me. Well, already you've raised some issues I'm sure we're going to come back to about the remit of the regulator, its funding, the reasons why it was set up, often, in response to some failure or some problem or other, and the popularity of regulatory decisions. So, Natalie, turning to you, why was there judged to be a need for an Office of Environmental Protection before it was set up in 2021?
It's an excellent question, Marshall. I mean, I should firstly say on our regulation podcast is we don't consider ourselves to be a regulator. We call ourselves rather euphemistically an oversight body, although we do have what I would call regulatory functions. And the reason there was an Office for Environmental Protection goes back to EU exit. Now, environmental law is a bit of a peculiar beast, and that's because primarily it has historically, certainly while we were in Europe, placed duties first and foremost on the state. And it places duties also directly on regulatory bodies in terms of protecting the environment. The environment doesn't have a voice all of itself, and perhaps that's why the framework works as it did. And historically, the way that the state has delivered on those commitments in law or not has been partly due to oversight from the European Commission. Now, as we left Europe, the European Commission's jurisdiction fell away, and what appeared quite quickly was something that was called the governance gap. And that's that accountability mechanism to make sure that government and the state more generally delivered on its environmental commitments. So as part of one of the flagship pieces of post-EU exit legislation, which was Environment Act 2021, it was conceived that a organisation called the OEP would be set up to fill that governance gap. And that's where it came from. And I think it was driven in part because of real anxiety from environmental NGOs that in the absence of some accountability mechanism that the environment would suffer materially. But it was also part of the commitments around EU exit that Brexit freedoms, for example, would be used to deliver enhanced protection for the environment. Because there's a lot of anxiety around EU exit that would be adversely impacted. And so here we are.
Fantastic. Now we've heard already quite different reasons for the establishment of these three bodies, the Healthcare Commission, IPSA, and yourself there at OEP, Natalie. Quite contextual in many ways. And that's something I think that we're going to have to bear in mind as we have a more general conversation about how regulators are set up. So, Natalie, sticking with you for a moment, you've explained why the regulator was set up, but how did you go about it? Because I know that you were appointed before the legislation was actually passed. And so I imagine that while civil servants and politicians were debating the law in Parliament, you were actually thinking about what to do in practice. So what did you focus on first and how did you prioritise?
So that's absolutely right. I came on board in February 2021. The legislation wasn't passed until November that year, although it was expected to pass sooner. So we were working with a moving timeline. When I came on board, there was a very, very small sort of skeleton crew of seconded in public servants who were working on the establishment of the OEP, but it was very, very embryonic. And I used very early on, I used an analogy that we were trying to build a plane and fly it at the same time. And there was a lot of political momentum to get the OEP up and on its feet as quickly as possible. And so very shortly after I joined, the organisation's board was confirmed. And they were a shot of intellectual capital, if you like. But there was no statutory powers on the statute books, and indeed they were still being debated. But we already knew that we had a job to be getting on with, and so we worked quite quickly to get the OEP established in shadow form, and that's a model that has been used in other parts of government where you want to have a lot of the structures in place when the legislation concludes, so that embryonic body can hit the ground running. And I think I came with two areas of focus, and these shifted over time, and these were the practical challenges of building a new organisation, and then the strategic challenge of what that organisation would then do. And we had the draft bill, but the clauses were still moving around, so we had to make some appointments. So those immediate practical challenges included, getting the board on board, onboarding them, building a governance framework. You are dealing with a blank sheet of paper, so putting a governance framework to allow that board to start making decisions. We spent time creating an operating model, so how the organisation was going to operate. And flowing from that was an organisation design piece, and we needed to do that to know what people to hire, so we had no staff at that point, to then start putting into place actually starting to hire people, which is a particular challenge when the organisation you're hiring into doesn't even exist yet, which was the case for us at the beginning. We had to put in place internal governance, including building executive governance so that we could make operational decisions, starting that recruitment, which was incredibly time consuming, and then onboarding, and then starting very early on to build the organisation's operations. We have investigation powers and we have litigation powers, and anyone who works in regulation understands that those need to be governed operationally very tightly. So that's some of the practical challenges. Concurrently with all of that, we wanted to start work straight away on the organisation's strategy. And the type of organisation that the OEP is quite unusual. There are very few precedents around government for that kind of organisation. So wasn't a blueprint to kind of copy. And so we used a methodology which is in a fantastic book, which I highly recommend, called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummel. It's a really excellent book. And we used some of the insight from that. So we did a diagnosis, which is one of the things the book suggests you do before you take a strategy. So which is for us was a kind of state of the nation. What is the situation that we're operating in? What are the threats? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What's the lay of the land? And we took some time to do that diagnosis. And then off the back of that, we developed some guiding principles for how we were going to operate. And they were very helpful in sharpening our focus. And that developed then into a first draft strategy. And we very much wanted, we're obliged in law to consult on our strategy, and we can't bring any of our operational powers online in the absence of that strategy. So we wanted to be able to get that out the door on the first possible day that we could. So we put that all together, and concurrently with that, and I remember this well, we developed our first business plan. I had about 50% of my staff on board, and I'd been there, I think, 6 months at that point, was the longest serving member of OEP staff. So you can imagine that. And we sat in a room and we threw all of the different issues that we'd identified through the diagnosis, so key primary issues in the environment sector. And we looked at them and broke them down to, what are really pressing big ticket issues in the environment sector? Where are things in flux? So where is there opportunity for positive influence and engagement? And where do those issues sit within the powers we're likely to have? Yeah. And that's what we did. And I remember it very well because we were all scratching our heads. But actually it emerged, a coherent program emerged from that approach. So we understood from the diagnosis the kind of situation that we're operating in. We knew broadly what we could do. And then we looked for where we could make positive difference. So we selected straight off the bat, we looked at laws for nature. Yeah. Because there was consultation coming on law reform for laws for nature that I felt was important. We chose water because water pollution is obviously a prominent and material environmental concern that a lot of people were very worried about, and where we could see plenty of potential for both improvement and change. And we didn't quite know how to articulate it then, but we call it now governance. Right. And that's how government fits the different moving parts together to deliver on its environmental agenda, which is a huge agenda, very like an ecosystem. It interconnects. And so we wanted to look very carefully at how the different moving parts in government connected with one another to create an effective set of delivery mechanisms. And remarkably, really, that has all stood up quite well from that workshop with the big whiteboard where we looked at those things.
That's fantastic. Well, that's a massive amount of really hard work that you put in there, Natalie. So I'm sure that those kinds of categories, the practical, the strategic, thinking about structures, people, governance, are generic to the establishment of all regulators. And Ian, just coming back to you, just listening to what Natalie's done over the last few years and thinking about what you did twice with different regulators, what are your reflections?
What Natalie describes is exactly what we confronted, and from the practical to the strategic. So I won't rehearse it. It rather reflects what she said. I mean, one or two things I'll say as regards the Healthcare Commission, and as particularly IT and data were central to the creation of a new regulator. If the regulator was going to be able to measure performance, it had to be able to get hold of data. And one of the crying shames of the NHS was there was a lot of stuff about, but it was all over the place, not coordinated, not properly analysed, and most importantly, didn't measure the stuff that was important. And so getting IT, which was, if you like, tailor-made, was a challenge both as regards the Healthcare Commission and as regards IPSA. As regards the Healthcare Commission, I'll just say one or two other things, building on what Natalie said, that yes, you had to have a vision which was understood and broadcast widely. There was a problem in the Healthcare Commission insofar as some of the workforce were brought in from other jobs that they had been doing, and they felt somewhat alienated by having been, as it were, abolished and brought into another organisation. So there was a great challenge in getting everyone to embrace that vision internally within the organisation. And then externally, there was the challenge that all regulators have to confront as to whether they are seen as an external enemy, crushing creativity, innovation, all the usual things that are said, rather than in the Healthcare Commission being seen as actually working on the side of people who are looking after patients and who were their patients themselves. That was a very significant challenge. One other thing, just to add as regards IPSA, Natalie has experience of having a shadow team with legislation still taking place. We confronted as well. And the shadow team were all young bloods from the civil service who regarded me as someone who was going to be told how to run the regulator, but not to have an idea myself. So that had to be changed. And then you had to work to have some effect on the legislation. And then the challenges were of any new regulator in an area of some dispute. You had to establish your legitimacy. Why are you there? Because you weren't elected, you aren't easily removable, and you aren't readily answerable and accountable. So you had to demonstrate you were independent, and you had to deal with the hostility that surrounded what you were doing. So in my view, and I'm sure this is true of Natalie as well, you had to be transparent. The regulator had to tell everybody what it was doing, why it was doing it, how it was doing, and then report on what it had found out. I might add, finally, and I'm sure this is Natalie's experience as well, we never had a problem with the staff. of the enterprise. They all believed in what we were doing. They believed they were doing something for the public good. And so that was never a challenge for me, not least because they shared the vision.
Very, very interesting. Goodness me. So I think, Natalie, the distinction that you drew earlier on between the strategic and the practical is helpful, because both of you were talking about some of the strategic challenges, the fact that legislation was going through Parliament, that the regulators were set up, or the bodies that you leading were set up with a purpose, where there was debate, the injection of intellectual capital, Natalie, that you referred to when the board came on, and Ian, your hope, your expectation, indeed, that as part of that intellectual capital that was brought on board, that you would have an input into the direction of the organisation quite legitimately. And then, so apart from all of those intellectual challenges which require certain skills, you had all the practical difficulties that you've both referred to, whether it's IT or data or structures or people. So just thinking about all of this, Natalie, coming back to you, all of these different issues that you both talked about, can we think about the risks and the things that you would advise people setting up new regulators to have a think about? Because there are people out there in government and elsewhere now setting up new regulators, as I said at the beginning. So what are the risks that you would advise them to focus on?
So firstly, I think something Ian said was really important. You need to be really clear, and your people need to be really clear why your organisation exists. And we spent time very early on making sure that everybody was really, really clear and what we were here to do, and that focus was really sharp. And the second thing is that as a new organisation, you have no track record, and you will have a range of, to varying degrees, a lot of scepticism that you can deliver on the policy commitments that have been made. We made it a big part of our job early on to build in the organisation's credibility. So Ian mentioned transparency. That was really important. It was really important to our stakeholders as well, and we built that in very early on. We worked really hard at really active engagement with our supporters, and also those who were sceptical about the organisation's ability to deliver. So we were very open and very much worked very, very closely with them. And there's something that I invested on really early on as well, which I think has paid real dividends. And that is, you probably heard the saying, don't you, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It was really important to me to develop a really strong organisational culture right from the beginning. So as we were onboarding people, they could embrace this. And part of that culture was learn by doing and iterate. Don't be frightened of making mistakes. If we're going to develop and evolve as an organisation rapidly, we're probably going to get things wrong. So fail fast and learn quickly. Develop things through iteration rather than wanting to get an absolutely perfect model. I was very much of the view that we've never done this before, neither has anybody else. We're almost certainly going to get some things wrong. Let's figure that out quickly and setting that culture. But in order for that to work, your people need to not be frightened of making mistakes. They need to feel empowered to speak up and to know that their voices are going to be heard. And so investing in that strong sense of the organisation was really vital. And I also set up OEP the first year we were in lockdown, and complete full lockdown for part of it. And so we didn't even meet in face-to-face for most of that first year. So that investment in building the organisation, a sense of belonging to it, took even more effort than when you can see people face to face. I think you have to lean into and embrace the fact that there are lots of things that you don't know early on, and be quite comfortable with that and be quite open about it, particularly with your stakeholders. But also get the basics right. Be seen to be independent in everything that you do, and be really clear with your staff. So independence is very important at the OEP, and have lots of active conversations about what that means in practice. Invest in your expertise. You can't really afford to be very wrong-footed in those early years where you are building credibility. So we knew at the OEP to have influence, we needed to be credible, which meant we needed to be evidence-based. We needed to be very obviously impartial. And we need to be rigorous in our work, and that was quite demanding early on, but definitely paid dividends and has paid dividends down the road.
Yeah.
Go and talk to other people. Go and learn from other people. So I lent into my broader networks to talk to other CEOs. We talked to other regulators who were very generous with their time, so that we weren't where we could take good practice from other places and develop more quickly. We did. And I think leaning into the community of regulators when you're setting up a new body, I would encourage anyone to do. There are people very, very generous in telling you about what they've done. And you can, I cherry-picked useful learning from multiple regulators, both with what worked and what didn't. And I'm grateful to many of them for their time.
Fantastic. Okay, two big takeaways I've heard there. One about the need for authority and credibility early on, and that's about independence, evidence-based, all of those kinds of things, and also the need to learn. And obviously, there's an Institute of Regulation that has a group of regulators, including yourself, Natalie, and others, where there's a community of people to learn from. So I just encourage people to take your advice on that front, Natalie. Ian, thinking also about risks and things that trip up new regulators, what would you focus on and advise?
I'll just pinpoint three. First would be to maintain a dialogue with everybody, not just the regulated, but the general public, and see if you can control that dialogue as well. You have to make yourself available. I've done phone-ins from Leon C and interviews on Parliament Green and anywhere in between. You have to, as it were, control that dialogue so that your voice is one of the voices heard. Secondly, as Natalie said, you'll make mistakes. So you have to address your missteps quickly, and you have to apologize for them and say, you'll do better. It wasn't difficult for me to be made aware of missteps, because between the office and walking to Parliament, I would be accosted by MPs routinely to illustrate the various faults in my working life. And some of them were valid, and we took them back and we addressed them. And there was a general sense that the regulator was listening, was not intent on being oppressive, and could change its mind in the face of evidence. And the third is watch out for mission creep, for overreach, for the desire, oh, that's an interesting problem, let's have a go at that. There's always enough on your plate as it is without messing around and trying to do other things.
Fantastic. Very succinct and punchy advice. Thank you very much, Ian. So, drawing to a close now, we've covered an enormous amount, and we've only just scratched the surface, I'm sure, talking about everything from the powers that regulators are given, and the way that boards set up, governance, staffing, and risks of mission creep and failures of one kind or another, which obviously need to be addressed, and all organisations and individuals are party to from time to time, and all of us in regulation are aware of that. So just finally, a quick tip that you might give somebody who's involved in setting up a regulator, whether a civil servant or somebody in a regulatory body. What would you, just in a nutshell, advise them to have in the front of their minds? Ian, let me start with you, then I'll come to Natalie before we close.
Okay, just a few tips. Communicate. That's the first tip. Secondly, surround yourself with good leaders, people who can say no to you. Thirdly, be clear on your duties and your powers. Fourthly, be clear about your funding and make sure that you secure it. Fifthly, state your targets and report on progress. And lastly, keep repeating the vision and hold to it.
Fantastic. My goodness me. Those need to be over the desk of every chair and chief executive, as far as I'm concerned. Natalie, what would your tips be?
That's such a fantastic list from me, and I don't know I can add anything. What I would say is this has been one of the best jobs I've ever had in my life. And you arrive with a blank sheet of paper and a vision, and then you have to build it. And I have thoroughly enjoyed it. So my top tip would be, don't run away from if you get the chance to work on a setup, take it. It is phenomenal. Coming in, and there's no baggage, there's no legacy. You can build something truly fantastic, and you will attract people who want to build and create something. And they are the very best people to work with. And you can have one of the most rewarding and privileged things I've ever done. So be enthusiastic and excited about it, because it is a tremendous opportunity. But keep your mission at the forefront of your mind at all times. Don't lose sight of your mission. It's where your legitimacy comes from, and you need to center it in everything that you do for many of the reasons that Ian's already explained beautifully.
Amazing. Well, goodness me, we started by listening to very different contextual factors that led to the establishment of the regulators that you've founded, and yet we've come to a lot of very shared thinking about what's important to consider and the risks to avoid, and the approach that you should take in the establishment of the regulator. So I'm very, very grateful to you both, and I hope that those listening have learned a lot as well. Thank you very much, Natalie Prosser from the Office for Environmental Protection, and Sir Ian Kennedy, formerly of the Healthcare Commission and IPSA. Thanks also to our sound engineer, Neil Bowerman of Bowerman Audio Production. And I hope that those of you listening to this discussion found it interesting. Please let your colleagues know, especially if they're setting up a new regulator, and tune in to future episodes where we'll discuss other issues of interest, with more material and events and training on the Institute of Regulation's website, ioregulation.org. Thanks again for listening to the Regulation Podcast with me, Marcia Albu. Good luck with your own regulatory challenges, and please stay in touch with the Institute and help regulation become the best it can. Thank you and goodbye.